When the fighting stopped in Europe in May 1945, the war did not end for Poland. It changed masters. The guns fell silent, but the country did not step into peace. It emerged from one occupation only to fall under another. Authority shifted overnight. Borders moved westward. Cities lay in ruins. What remained was a wounded nation forced to rebuild itself while its sovereignty slipped quietly beyond reach. For millions of Polish civilians, the end of Nazi rule was not simple liberation. It marked the beginning of a different uncertainty. Poland in 1945 was no longer the country that had existed in 1939. It was geographically displaced, demographically shattered, and politically redefined by powers beyond its control. 6 years of war had devastated the land more thoroughly than almost anywhere else in Europe. An estimated 6 million Polish citizens were dead, half of them Jewish victims of systematic extermination. Entire communities had vanished. Villages were burned to the ground. Towns stood hollow and silent. The social fabric that once held the country together had been ripped apart, thread by thread. In Warsaw, destruction reached levels that defied comprehension. After the failed Warsaw Uprising of 1944, German forces deliberately demolished the city district by district. When Soviet troops entered in January 1945, nearly 85% of the capital lay in ruins. Streets had disappeared beneath mountains of rubble. Churches stood roofless. Government buildings were gutted shells. The royal castle was a broken outline against the sky. What had once been a living European capital had become an expanse of debris. But Warsaw was only the most visible symbol. In cities like Wrocław, Gdansk, Poznan and Szczecin, fighting during the final months of the war had left industrial zones shattered and residential districts burned. In smaller towns, retreating German forces destroyed rail hubs and dismantled machinery. Factories were stripped of equipment, bridges were blown apart, roads were cratered and impassable. Rail lines twisted across the countryside like broken veins. In rural regions, the devastation was quieter but no less severe. Fields had been mined or left untended for years. Livestock numbers had collapsed. Farmhouses stood abandoned. Entire villages in eastern Poland had been destroyed during German anti-partisan operations. Forests concealed unmarked graves. In some areas, entire family lines had vanished. Poland's Jewish population, once the largest in Europe, had been almost entirely annihilated. Before the war, Jewish life had been deeply interwoven into Polish society, economically, culturally, intellectually. After 1945, that presence was largely gone. Survivors emerging from camps or hiding returned to find their neighborhoods altered beyond recognition. Homes were occupied. Synagogues were ruins. In some towns, hostility greeted their return. The absence was overwhelming, not just in numbers, but in memory. The war had also targeted Poland's educated class. Teachers, priests, lawyers, professors, officers, and community leaders had been systematically arrested and executed. The country emerged not only depopulated, but structurally weakened. Institutions existed, but the people who once sustained them were gone. As German authority collapsed, Soviet forces advanced across the country. For many Poles, the Red Army represented both liberation and apprehension. Nazi occupation ended. Deportations and mass executions ceased. Yet Poland did not regain full independence. Instead, a Soviet-backed provisional government began consolidating power. Political pluralism narrowed rapidly. Opposition leaders were arrested. Members of the wartime resistance were interrogated. The Home Army, once celebrated as the embodiment of national resistance, was dismantled. Some of its leaders were imprisoned, others disappeared. In forests and rural regions, armed groups continued to operate. They believed the struggle for sovereignty had not ended. The new authorities labeled them enemies of the state. Trials were held. Sentences were harsh. For many families, peace felt conditional. For ordinary civilians, daily life revolved around survival. Food shortages dominated 1945 and 1946. Agricultural output had been severely disrupted. Transport infrastructure was unreliable, limiting distribution. Urban residents relied on ration cards that rarely provided sufficient calories. Bread lines formed before dawn. Potatoes, cabbage, and thin soup became staples. Black markets flourished in the shadows of ruined buildings. Cigarettes functioned as currency. Watches, jewelry, and clothing were exchanged for flour or meat. City dwellers traveled to rural areas carrying bundles to barter for food. Long journeys across damaged rail lines became common. Housing shortages were severe. In bond cities, multiple families shared single apartments. Windows were covered with boards or cloth. Heating fuel was scarce. People dismantled wooden beams from ruined structures to keep warm during the winter. Malnutrition weakened children and the elderly. Tuberculosis and typhus spread in overcrowded quarters. Hospitals operated with limited medicine and outdated equipment. Children grew up among ruins. Playgrounds were piles of bricks. Schools reopened gradually, but textbooks were scarce and many teachers were gone. Entire generations had experienced formative years under occupation. War was not an event, it was their childhood. At the same time, Poland underwent one of the largest forced population movements in European history. Under agreements reached by the Allied powers, Poland's eastern territories were annexed by the Soviet Union. In compensation, Poland received formerly German lands in the west and north. Millions of Germans were expelled. Simultaneously, millions of Poles from the east were forced to relocate westward. Trains packed with families crossed shattered landscapes. People carried what they could: bedding, tools, photographs, religious icons. They arrived in towns whose architecture reflected a different past. German inscriptions were removed. New Polish names replaced old ones. Houses still contained traces of former occupants. Entire communities were rebuilt from strangers. People from different regions, dialects, and traditions found themselves neighbors overnight. Social bonds had to be forged anew. The state encouraged settlement in Western territories, presenting them as reclaimed lands. Yet for many, the relocation felt disorienting. Returning soldiers faced a changed homeland. Some integrated into the new political structures. Others were viewed with suspicion. Former resistance members were monitored. The state expected loyalty. Public dissent became risky. Political consolidation accelerated by the late 1940s. Elections were manipulated. Opposition parties were marginalized or dissolved. Independent press diminished. Industry was nationalized. The economy shifted towards centralized planning. Heavy industry was prioritized. Coal mines resumed production. Shipyards reopened. Steelworks expanded. Reconstruction was framed as collective effort. Yet consumer goods remained scarce. Long queues outside shops became routine. Clothing, household items, and basic goods were limited. Religious life offered continuity. Churches filled on Sundays. Rituals provided structure amid uncertainty. Yet even religious institutions operated within defined political limits. Psychologically, the country was exhausted. Years of occupation, underground activity, deportation, and loss had reshaped personal boundaries. Silence became common within families. Stories were avoided. Trauma was rarely processed publicly. Conversations about wartime compromises or collaboration were often suppressed. In Warsaw, reconstruction carried symbolic meaning. Architects undertook the ambitious rebuilding of the old town based on paintings and historical records. Brick by brick, facades were recreated. Reconstruction became an act of national affirmation, a declaration that destruction would not erase identity. Yet no rebuilding could restore what had vanished. A third of the pre-war population was gone. Jewish Poland had been nearly erased. Borders had shifted permanently. Entire regions of memory lay beyond new frontiers. Families were scattered across unfamiliar territories. Between 1945 and the early 1950s, Poland entered a new phase, no longer defined by open warfare, but by political realignment and controlled reconstruction. The state emphasized narratives of liberation and progress. Alternative interpretations were discouraged. For many citizens, the war did not feel concluded. It felt transformed. The violence of occupation had ended, but uncertainty, displacement, and restricted sovereignty remained. Recovery unfolded gradually. Rail lines were repaired. Housing projects expanded. Industrial output increased. Universities trained new generations. Markets stabilized. Yet beneath the surface, the weight of loss persisted. Graves remained unmarked. Families searched for missing relatives. Photographs were the only surviving record of vanished communities. The scale of demographic rupture reshaped society permanently. For those who survived, 1945 was not a clean break. It was a turning point in a longer story of endurance. Poland had endured invasion from both west and east. It had suffered occupation, genocide, and devastation. And when the war ended, it entered a new geopolitical reality. In the years immediately following the war, daily life in Poland settled into a rhythm that was neither normal nor openly chaotic. It was a fragile stability, maintained through adaptation rather than confidence. People learned how to live within limits. Food remained rationed longer than many had expected. Even when harvests improved, distribution inefficiencies and state procurement quotas kept shortages common. In cities, families calculated meals carefully. Meat was rare. Sugar and coffee were luxuries. Substitutes became part of ordinary life. Children grew up accustomed to scarcity, measuring normality not by abundance, but by endurance. Housing reconstruction could not keep pace with demand. Bombed districts were cleared slowly. Entire families shared single rooms. Newly settled Western territories faced a different problem. There were houses, but not always trust. Former German properties carried emotional weight. Some families felt unease inhabiting homes that still bore traces of displacement. The physical reconstruction of Poland did not erase the psychological complexity of resettlement. Employment was available, but increasingly shaped by ideology. Loyalty to the new political system became as important as competence. Career advancement often required party affiliation. Those unwilling to adapt found their opportunities narrowing. Public life was reorganized around state institutions. Youth organizations, labor unions, and cultural associations were aligned with official doctrine. Propaganda emphasized unity and progress. Posters displayed images of workers rebuilding cities, farmers harvesting fields, students studying under bright futures. Yet the contrast between imagery and lived experience was noticeable. Reconstruction was real, but so were queues, shortages, and quiet fear. At the same time, generational differences began to emerge. Adults who had experienced pre-war Poland carried memories of a sovereign republic. Younger children had known only occupation and upheaval. Their understanding of nationhood was shaped by post-war borders and new political narratives. The Poland they inherited was different from the one their parents remembered. Cultural life slowly reawakened. Theaters reopened. Newspapers circulated. Writers attempted to articulate experiences that felt almost impossible to express. Yet artistic freedom operated within defined boundaries. Certain themes were encouraged: heroism, collective struggle, reconstruction. Others were treated cautiously. The countryside experienced its own transformation. Land reforms redistributed estates. Large landowners lost property. Peasants gained plots, but often lacked equipment and capital. Agricultural collectivization pressures increased toward the late 1940s. Rural communities adjusted cautiously, aware that resistance carried consequences. Religious identity remained deeply rooted, offering continuity across political change. Churches were filled not only for worship, but for familiarity. Rituals provided emotional stability. In a society where public speech was constrained, private faith became one of the few enduring anchors. Despite hardship, resilience was visible. Markets filled with cautious trade. Weddings were celebrated. Children were born into a country still rebuilding itself. People planted gardens in bomb craters. They repaired doors with salvaged wood. They improvised. Yet beneath this persistence lay unresolved grief. Mass graves were still being discovered. Families waited for confirmation about missing relatives. Letters from former prisoners arrived years late, or never arrived at all. Mourning stretched across seasons without closure. By the early 1950s, Poland had stabilized outwardly. Industry functioned. Infrastructure had been partially restored. New apartment blocks rose where ruins once stood. The state projected confidence. Internationally, Poland existed firmly within the Eastern Bloc. But stability did not erase memory. The war had reshaped the country's borders, population, and political identity. It had eliminated entire communities. It had displaced millions. It had redefined sovereignty. For those who lived through it, survival was not a heroic narrative. It was a necessity. They rebuilt cities while carrying absence. They adapted to authority while remembering independence. They created routines within uncertainty. The war had ended, but its consequences did not. They settled into architecture, into demographics, into silence, and into the generations that followed.